You probably think of rye bread as that dense, dark loaf you see at the deli counter. Something old-fashioned, a little heavy. Maybe something your German grandmother used to eat. But for a medieval peasant in Northern Europe, rye wasn't a choice. It was the only thing standing between their family and starvation. Wheat couldn't survive in their soil. Barley barely rose when baked. Rye was the grain that grew where nothing else would. In frozen Scandinavian fields, in the sandy soil of northern Germany, in the thin dirt of the Polish lowlands. It grew through snow. It survived frost that killed every other crop. And when those peasants turned that grain into bread, they used a process so specific that modern science is only now figuring out why it worked. A fermentation method that didn't just make bread rise. It dismantled a chemical weapon hidden inside the grain itself, unlocked minerals your body couldn't otherwise absorb, and created compounds that fed bacteria in your gut that most modern bread actively starves. By the end of this video, you'll understand why medieval rye bread was more nutritious than almost anything on the bread aisle of your supermarket today, and why the method they used was abandoned not because it failed, but because it was too slow for factories. Let's start with what rye actually meant in the medieval world, because this wasn't a trendy alternative grain. This was survival itself. In most of Northern Europe between the 10th and 15th centuries, rye was the dominant bread grain. South of the Alps, people ate wheat. North of the Alps, people ate rye. That line across Europe was as sharp as a border on a map. It was dictated by climate, soil, and altitude. Rye could grow in soil so poor that wheat wouldn't even germinate. It could be sown in autumn, survive under snow or winter, and be ready for harvest in early summer. For a peasant running a small subsistence farm, this was everything. If your wheat failed, you went hungry. Rye almost never failed. Bread made up 60 to 70% of a medieval peasant's daily calories. A single adult consumed 2 to 3 pounds of bread every day, not as a side dish, as the meal. Bread was breakfast, lunch, and dinner, sometimes eaten with porridge, sometimes dipped in broth, sometimes just eaten plain. When chronicles from the Great Famine of 1315 describe the collapse of European society, they're describing what happens when the bread supply fails. An estimated 10 to 15% of Northern Europe's population died in 7 years. Not from plague, from rain that wouldn't stop and grain that wouldn't ripen. So when a medieval peasant spent 3 days making a single batch of rye bread, they weren't being quaint. They were performing the single most important task in their household. And they were using a technique so precise that skipping one step would ruin everything. Here's the problem that medieval bakers had to solve, and the reason you can't just bake rye bread the way you bake wheat bread. Rye contains an enzyme called amylase. Wheat has amylase too, but wheat amylase breaks down at the temperatures inside an oven. It stops working before it can do any damage. Rye amylase is different. It stays active at much higher temperatures. And what it does is attack starch. Starch is what gives bread its structure. In wheat bread, gluten does most of the heavy lifting. It creates the stretchy framework that traps gas and makes the loaf rise. But rye has almost no usable gluten. Rye's version, called secolin, is weak. So rye bread depends on its starch and on complex sugars called pentosans to hold itself together. Now imagine what happens when you mix rye flour with water and bake it. The amylase wakes up. It starts eating the starch. The very thing holding your bread together is being dissolved from the inside. The result is a gummy, collapsed, inedible brick. Medieval bakers couldn't see enzymes. They didn't know the word amylase, but they absolutely knew what happened when they skipped the crucial step. The bread failed. And failed bread meant wasted grain that took months to grow. Their solution was acid. Lactic acid, produced by bacteria during sourdough fermentation, drops the pH of the dough. When the pH falls below about 5.5, the amylase enzyme slows down dramatically. It can't attack the starch fast enough to destroy the bread structure before the oven's heat sets it permanently. The acid doesn't kill the enzyme, it hobbles it. It buys the bread just enough time. This is why rye bread requires sourdough as a chemical necessity. Without the acid from fermentation, rye bread physically cannot hold together. Medieval bakers discovered this through centuries of trial and error, through generations of watching dough fail and figuring out what made it work. The process started with the sourdough starter, called a leaven. In medieval households across Scandinavia and northern Germany, this starter was kept alive continuously, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. A portion of fermented dough was saved from each baking session and used to start the next one. The starter contained wild yeast and lactobacillus bacteria, a living ecosystem that the baker fed with flour and water. The night before baking, the baker mixed a portion of the starter with rye flour and warm water. This created what modern bakers call a sponge. It sat overnight, sometimes for 12 hours, sometimes longer. During those hours, the bacteria went to work. They consumed sugars in the flour and produced lactic acid and acetic acid. The dough became sour. The pH dropped. The amylase was neutralized. The smell would hit you before you saw it. Sharp, tangy, almost alcoholic. The surface of the sponge bubbled slowly. It rose, but not dramatically, not the way wheat dough inflates. Rye dough moves like something thick and alive. The texture is sticky, dense, almost like wet clay. You couldn't knead it the way you knead wheat bread. It would stick to your hands and never let go. The next morning, the baker added more flour, salt, and sometimes a handful of caraway seeds. The dough was mixed quickly. Rye dough doesn't benefit from long kneading because there's no gluten network to develop. Overwork it and you break down the starch structure you're trying to protect. The loaves were shaped by hand, wet hands because the dough was impossibly sticky, and placed into wooden forms or onto leaves laid on the hearthstone. In many Scandinavian households, the bread was baked in a communal oven shared by the village. You brought your dough, you waited your turn. The oven had been heated by burning wood inside it for hours, then raking out the coals and sliding the bread in. The residual heat in the stone walls did the baking. Temperatures started high, around 480 degrees Fahrenheit, and slowly fell as the stone cooled. Rye bread baked slowly, not the 25 minutes of a modern wheat loaf. A dense rye loaf might spend 90 minutes to 2 hours in that cooling oven. Some traditional pumpernickel recipes baked for up to 24 hours in a sealed tin at low temperature. That long, slow bake transformed the sugars in the rye through the Maillard reaction, producing the deep, dark, almost chocolatey flavour that defines real rye bread. When the bread finally came out, it was dark. Not the pale gold of a wheat loaf, deep brown, almost black in the thickest parts. The crust was hard and thick, sometimes a quarter inch. The interior was dense, moist and close textured. You couldn't tear it apart like a baguette. You cut it with a knife, thin slices, because the density made thick slices a workout for your jaw. This bread didn't taste like modern bread. It tasted sour, earthy, with a sweetness that came from the slow-baked sugars. It smelled like fermentation and grain and wood smoke from the oven. For a medieval peasant, this smell meant the household would eat for another week. And here's what that peasant didn't know. While they were protecting the bread from its own enzymes, the fermentation process was doing something else entirely. Something that modern science has only recently measured. Rye grain is packed with minerals: iron, zinc, magnesium, phosphorus. But those minerals are locked up. They're bound to a compound called phytic acid, sometimes called phytate. Phytic acid grabs onto minerals and holds them so tightly that your digestive system can't pry them loose. You eat the bread. The minerals pass right through you. Your body gets nothing. This is the problem with most modern whole grain bread. It contains minerals on the nutrition label, but your body can't actually absorb a large portion of them because the phytic acid hasn't been dealt with. Medieval sourdough fermentation dealt with it. When lactobacillus bacteria ferment rye flour, they produce acid. That acid activates an enzyme already present in the rye grain called phytase. Phytase does exactly what the name suggests. It breaks down phytic acid. It snaps the molecular handcuffs off the minerals and sets them free. A study published in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that sourdough fermentation reduced phytic acid in whole wheat bread by 62%, compared to just 38% for standard yeast fermentation. In rye bread specifically, the results were even more dramatic. Research on traditional long-fermented rye bread showed that 99% of the phytic acid was degraded during the process. 99%. The minerals in that bread, the iron, the zinc, the magnesium, were almost entirely available for your body to use. And it gets more interesting. Researchers at the University of Eastern Finland discovered what they call the rye factor. When people ate whole grain rye bread, their bodies produced significantly less insulin than when they ate wheat bread containing the same amount of carbohydrates. Same blood sugar, less insulin. Your pancreas had to work less hard. A study published in Nature found that rye sourdough contained a wide range of gut-healthy compounds, including branched-chain amino acids and bioactive peptides that were produced specifically by the lactic acid bacteria during fermentation. Wheat sourdough had some of these compounds too, but rye had significantly more. The Frontiers in Microbiology journal published a mouse feeding study in 2022 comparing sourdough bread to standard yeast-leavened bread. The sourdough group showed lower glycemic response, increased magnesium absorption, and decreased total cholesterol and triglycerides. The researchers attributed these effects to the dietary fiber and short-chain fatty acids produced during the fermentation process. Medieval peasants who ate long-fermented rye sourdough every single day were feeding their gut bacteria a diet that modern nutritional science would consider almost ideal. They didn't know about the microbiome, but their bread was engineered by centuries of practice to work with it. So if this bread was so effective, why did we stop making it this way? The answer is the same force that killed most traditional food methods: industrial speed. Traditional rye sourdough takes 1 to 3 days from starter to finished loaf. That timeline is incompatible with industrial bread production. When the Chorleywood bread process was invented in Britain in 1961, it made it possible to go from flour to finished bread in under 3.5 hours. High-speed mechanical mixing replaced slow fermentation. Chemical additives replaced time. The bread industry could suddenly produce loaves at a speed and cost that no traditional baker could match. Rye was especially vulnerable to this shift. Because rye bread requires sourdough fermentation to function at all, you can't easily shortcut it. You can shortcut wheat bread by adding commercial yeast and dough conditioners. But rye without acid just collapses, so the industry did something simpler. It stopped making real rye bread. Most rye bread sold in supermarkets today is primarily wheat flour with a small amount of rye added for colour and flavour. The dark colour often comes from caramel colouring or molasses, not from the Maillard reaction of a long bake. The sourdough tang comes from added citric acid, not from actual bacterial fermentation. The bread looks like rye. it tastes vaguely like rye. But the fermentation process that made medieval rye bread nutritionally remarkable has been skipped entirely. The phytic acid hasn't been broken down. The minerals are still locked up. The gut-healthy compounds from bacterial fermentation were never produced. The amylase was managed by adding wheat gluten rather than by acidification. We replaced a 3-day biological process with a 3-hour industrial one, and the bread lost everything that made it worth eating in the first place. You can make real medieval-style rye bread at home. It requires patience, but the process is simpler than you think. Step 1. Build or maintain a sourdough starter using rye flour. Feed it equal parts rye flour and water by weight every day for at least 5 days until it's active and bubbly. Rye starters ferment faster than wheat starters because rye has more wild yeast and bacteria on the grain. Step 2. The night before baking, mix 100 grams of your active starter with 300 grams of whole rye flour and 300 milliliters of warm water. Stir it into a thick paste. Cover it and leave it at room temperature for 12 to 16 hours. This is your sponge. By morning, it should be bubbly and smell sharply sour. Step 3. Add 200 grams more rye flour, 10 grams of salt, and optionally a tablespoon of caraway seeds. Mix with a wet spoon or wet hands. Do not knead. The dough will be sticky and thick, more like a batter than a dough. This is normal. Step 4. Transfer the dough into a greased loaf pan. Smooth the top with a wet hand. Cover it and let it proof for 2 to 4 hours at room temperature until it rises slightly. Rye dough will never double the way wheat dough does. Step 5. Bake at 480 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 minutes, then reduce to 350 degrees and bake for another 60 to 90 minutes. The crust should be dark and hard, the interior dense and moist. Step 6. This is the step most people skip. Let the bread cool completely, then wrap it in a cloth and wait at least 24 hours before cutting it. Rye bread needs time for the interior starches to set. Cut it too early and the inside will be gummy. This isn't a failure. It's rye being rye. What you'll end up with looks nothing like supermarket bread. It's dark, heavy and dense. A thin slice has more flavour than a thick slice of white bread. The taste is sour, slightly sweet from the long bake, earthy, and deeply satisfying. One slice with butter fills you up in a way that 3 slices of modern bread can't touch. This isn't convenient. It takes 2 days from start to finish. But every hour of that process is doing something that industrial bread skips entirely. Breaking down phytic acid, producing organic acids, generating the compounds that your gut bacteria actually need. Medieval peasants baking rye bread in a village oven weren't health enthusiasts. They were survivors using the only grain that would grow in their soil and a fermentation process that was the only way to make that grain edible. They didn't know about phytase or lactic acid bacteria or the rye factor. But through centuries of observation, they built a process that modern science is only now confirming was quietly brilliant. We traded that process for speed and ended up with bread that looks like rye, but works like white flour. The knowledge isn't lost. It's sitting in your kitchen waiting for flour, water, and time. If you found this valuable, hit that like button and subscribe. We're dedicated to uncovering the food science that our ancestors mastered through observation and that modern industry quietly abandoned. Drop a comment and tell us, have you ever tasted real long-fermented rye bread? And if so, did you notice the difference? Because once you've had the real thing, the supermarket version never tastes the same.